The collapse of the persona is often mistaken for depression. Carl Jung: you faced your shadow, you did the work, you healed the wounds, and now you feel nothing. No drive, no spark, no ambition left. The worst part: you can't explain why you should feel better, but instead you're wondering if you broke something inside yourself. What if this isn't failure? What if this silence is actually your soul finally refusing to perform? There's something nobody tells you about Carl Jung's shadow work. Something therapists don't warn you about when you start digging into your unconscious patterns. When you finish excavating all that buried shame, those unmet needs, those childhood wounds that have been running your life from the shadows. You don't just feel better, you feel different, fundamentally, unsettlingly different. Meet Emma, a marketing director who spent 3 years in intensive therapy after a breakdown revealed patterns she'd been carrying since childhood. She did everything right: EMDR parts, work, shadow integration, inner child healing. She faced it all. The anxiety that had driven her for decades dissolved. The need to please everyone melted away. The fear of being alone transformed into genuine self-companionship. But when she tried to return to her corner office, to the campaigns that once excited her, to the promotions she'd been chasing for years, something felt fundamentally wrong. Not bad wrong, just empty. Like she was wearing clothes that belonged to someone else. The client meetings that used to energize her left, her feeling hollow. The success metrics that once mattered seemed like elaborate distractions from something she couldn't name. "I used to wake up every morning with fire in my belly," she told me. Even if it was anxiety, even if it was fear, it was fuel. Now I wake up and feel nothing. Like I'm waiting for instructions from a voice that isn't speaking anymore. This is what Jung called the necessary dissolution before rebirth. But nobody prepares you for how quiet it feels in the space between who you were and who you're becoming. Here's the psychological truth that changes everything: your old ambition was never actually yours. It belonged to your wounds. For years, maybe decades, you were motivated by unconscious forces you never chose. The need to be loved, the fear of abandonment, the drive to prove your worth, the terror of not being enough. These weren't conscious decisions. They were survival mechanisms running in the background, pushing you forward, keeping you busy, making you productive. But Carl Jung's shadow work doesn't just heal these wounds. It exposes the entire machinery. Suddenly you can see how much of your life was driven by fear, wearing the mask of ambition. How much of your motivation was actually just avoiding pain, dressed up as pursuing pleasure. How much of your success was built on the foundation of never feeling like enough. Think about your greatest achievements, the moments you felt most driven, most alive, most unstoppable. If you're brutally honest with yourself, how much of that fire came from genuine desire versus sophisticated desperation? How much was authentic inspiration versus dressed-up anxiety? How much was love for the work itself versus the need to prove you were worthy of love? When shadow work happens, when you truly integrate those rejected parts of yourself, your entire motivational system doesn't just shift, it disintegrates. And that disintegration isn't pathology, it's transformation. The old you climbed ladders powered by what you lacked. The healed you can no longer pretend those ladders lead anywhere real. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the death of the persona. The mask we wear to fit into society, the character we perform to get our needs met. The persona isn't who we really are. It's who we think we need to be to survive. And for most of us, our entire life has been organized around feeding and maintaining that performed self. Your career, your relationships, your goals, your entire sense of purpose. All of it was designed to sustain a version of you that you now recognize as incomplete at best, false at worst. So what happens when that version of you dies, but you haven't yet discovered who you really are underneath? You feel unmotivated, because motivation, real motivation, can only come from truth. And the truth is still emerging. It's like realizing you've been running a marathon on borrowed fuel and suddenly stopping. The silence feels terrifying because you've never known motivation without fear. You've never experienced drive without deficit. You've never felt purpose without proving. You've never pursued goals that weren't somehow trying to heal an old wound or fill an ancient emptiness. This emptiness you're experiencing isn't depression in the clinical sense. You're not hopeless or worthless. You're not unable to function. You're just not motivated by the same things anymore. And without those familiar carrots and sticks, without those unconscious drivers that have been running your life, you don't know how to move forward. Jung understood this as a sign that your psyche is undergoing a fundamental reorganization. The ego, your sense of separate self, is no longer in the driver's seat. But the self, your deeper, more authentic essence, hasn't fully emerged yet. You're in the in-between space, the liminal realm, the void that exists between one way of being and another. This void has a texture, a quality that's hard to describe, but impossible to miss once you're in it. It's not the heavy darkness of depression or the sharp pain of grief. It's more like existing in a soundproof room after living next to a highway your entire life. The sudden absence of noise you didn't even realize was there. Your nervous system, accustomed to the constant hum of anxiety-driven motivation, doesn't know what to do with this quiet. Pause here and take a breath. Is this what you've been carrying? This sense that you should feel more motivated, more driven, more alive than you do. The truth is, your psyche is protecting you from going backward. It's refusing to let you re-engage with motivations that were never truly yours to begin with. But it hasn't yet revealed what will motivate you moving forward. This isn't laziness. This isn't failure. This isn't even stagnation. This is your soul taking a sacred pause before the next phase of your becoming. But we live in a culture that pathologizes stillness, that medicates mystery, that tries to fix what might not be broken at all. Here's the revelation that transforms everything. You didn't lose motivation because you're weak or broken or failing. You lost it because you've healed to the point where your soul literally refuses to run on anxiety anymore. This is individuation beginning, Carl Jung's term for the process of becoming who you actually are versus who you think you should be. Let me tell you about Marcus, a successful architect who spent 4 years working through childhood trauma and attachment wounds. The healing process was profound. He felt more at peace than he ever had in his life. But when he tried to return to his work, designing buildings, managing projects, climbing the corporate ladder, he felt like he was wearing clothes that didn't fit anymore. "I used to be so driven," he told me. "I'd work 60-hour weeks and love it. I had 5-year plans, 10-year goals. I knew exactly what I wanted and exactly how to get it. Now I look at those same goals and feel nothing. It's like they belong to someone else." Marcus thought he was depressed. He went to his doctor, considered medication, wondered if he needed more therapy. But what he was experiencing wasn't depression. It was the natural result of profound inner change. His old motivations, proving his worth through achievement, earning his father's approval through success, avoiding the shame of failure, were no longer available to him. Carl Jung's shadow work had healed those wounds, integrated those needs, resolved those fears. But his new motivations, the ones that would come from his authentic self rather than his wounded ego, hadn't emerged yet. When you integrate your shadow, when you truly face and embrace those rejected parts of yourself, you don't just resolve psychological conflicts. You stop needing to prove your worth through external achievement. The ego structure that required constant validation crumbles, and with it all the motivations that fed that structure. Who are you without the goals the world gave you? This is the question that terrifies the healed. Because for the first time, you're free to discover what you actually want, not what you've been conditioned to want, not what would impress others, not what would finally make you feel enough. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming requires first unbecoming. You must lose the false self before the real self can emerge. Your old ambitions are dissolving because they belong to someone you're no longer willing to be." Think about this for a moment. Every goal you've ever set, every promotion you've chased, every achievement you've celebrated, how many of them were actually yours? How many came from your authentic desires versus inherited expectations? Societal programming, or the desperate need to prove you weren't the wounded child who once felt invisible, unworthy, or unsafe? The answers to these questions can be devastating and liberating. Because once you see how much of your life was built on borrowed dreams, you can't go back to living them. Your soul won't let you. This is what Jung called the nigredo phase of psychological alchemy, the necessary darkness, the void, the dissolution that must happen before new life can emerge. In medieval alchemy, nigredo was the blackening, the death of the old form, before any transformation could begin. Your old life, the one driven by fear and need, and the endless hunger for external validation, that life is over. You did the work to end it. You faced your Carl Jung shadow specifically so you wouldn't have to live that way anymore. But here's what makes this so confusing in our culture. We've been taught that healing should feel good, that growth should be linear, that progress should be measurable. Instead, shadow work often works like surgery. The procedure is successful, but the recovery is long, strange, and nothing like what you expected. During this phase, you might find yourself unable to care about things that used to matter deeply. Career goals that once seemed vital now feel arbitrary. Relationships that once excited you might feel performative. Hobbies that used to bring joy might feel forced. This confusion, you feel this emptiness, this sense that nothing matters anymore. This is what it feels like when your motivation system shifts from fear-based to truth-based, from external to internal, from performing to being. It's disorienting because you've never lived this way before. But here's what's emerging in that void space for your authentic self to speak. Jung distinguished between the ego, your small separate self, and the self, your deeper connected essence. The ego screams, the self whispers. The ego demands, the self invites. The ego creates urgency. The self creates resonance. As long as your life is full of ego-driven ambition, you can't hear what the self is trying to tell you. This is why the silence is sacred, why the emptiness is necessary, why losing old motivation isn't a problem to solve but a gift to receive. Your soul is creating the conditions for you to finally hear your own voice underneath all the inherited shoulds and suppressed wants and societal expectations. The question isn't, how do I get my ambition back? The question is, what is my soul trying to tell me in this silence? Because when you learn to listen to that whisper, when you learn to trust that gentle guidance, motivation stops being about conquering your resistance and starts being about following your resonance. If this is hitting something deep in you, if this is naming what you've been unable to articulate, keep going. The next part might feel like looking in a mirror you've been avoiding. What happens when you stop fighting the void and start listening to it? When you stop pathologizing the silence and start honoring it as sacred space? This is where transformation begins. Not through force, but through surrender. Not through fixing, but through feeling. Not through doing, but through being. Let me share what this looked like for Daniel, a software engineer who lost all interest in coding after working through complex PTSD and abandonment trauma. For months, he panicked. He tried to force his old passion to return. He set goals, created accountability systems, even considered career coaching. Nothing worked. The more he pushed, the more empty he felt. Finally, exhausted from fighting himself, he surrendered to the void. Instead of scheduling his days with productivity hacks, he started taking long walks without podcasts. Instead of filling every moment with information, he sat in silence without meditation apps. Instead of trying to optimize his way back to motivation, he simply allowed himself to be present without any agenda. One morning, walking past a community garden he'd driven by thousands of times without seeing something stirred. Not ambition in the old sense. No urgency, no strategy, no 5-year plan. Just resonance. A quiet recognition. A sense of rightness he couldn't explain but didn't need to. He found himself stopping, then returning the next day, then volunteering to help tend the plants. He started learning about soil composition, not because it would advance his career, but because something in him came alive when his hands touched earth. He discovered he had an intuitive understanding of what plants needed, when to water, when to harvest, how to nurture growth. 6 months later, he'd left his lucrative tech job to become an urban farming consultant. Not because he'd figured out a business plan, but because something authentic had finally found its voice. The work didn't feel like work. It felt like coming home to a part of himself he'd never known existed. This is how real motivation emerges after Carl Jung's shadow work, quietly, organically, without fanfare or force. Jung called this following the transcendent function, the capacity to bridge conscious intention with unconscious wisdom, to allow something larger than your ego to move through you and guide your choices. When you're no longer driven by what you lack, you become drawn to what serves your deepest nature. The difference is everything. Old motivation felt like hunger, desperate, urgent, never satisfied no matter how much you achieved. New motivation feels like magnetism, steady, undeniable, inherently fulfilling regardless of the outcome. You don't chase opportunities like a starving person grabbing at food. You recognize them like someone who knows they belong at the feast. You don't force passion like you're trying to jumpstart a dead battery. You follow curiosity like you're following a thread that leads somewhere worth going. You don't create from emptiness, desperate to fill a void. You create from fullness, because something inside you is so alive, it has to express itself. Signs your authentic ambition is emerging projects call to you instead of you forcing your interest. You feel curious rather than compulsive, inspired rather than driven, magnetic rather than manic. You work because the work itself delights you, not because you need the outcome to prove something. You pursue goals that serve your soul, not your image. Sarah, the marketing director I mentioned earlier, discovered through this process that her fear-based ambition had been covering up a deep longing to work with animals, not because she thought she should not, because it would look good to others, not because it would solve her problems or prove her worth, but because something in her came alive around creatures who lived authentically without pretense or performance. It took her 18 months to make the transition from corporate executive to veterinary assistant. 18 months of following curiosity rather than clarity, of trusting the process rather than controlling the outcome, of taking small steps toward what felt true rather than giant leaps toward what looked impressive. Her friends thought she was having a midlife crisis. Her family worried about the pay cut. Her logical mind had a million objections. But her soul was singing again for the first time in decades. The work felt like play. The animals responded to her presence with a trust that no corporate client had ever offered. She was earning less money, but feeling infinitely richer. Take a moment here. Can you feel the difference between Sarah's old ambition and her new calling? The old energy was sharp, urgent, driven by what she lacked. The new energy is soft, steady, drawn by what she loves. This is the signature of authentic motivation. It doesn't feel like work because it's aligned with your essence. Jung observed, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder, a secret order." Your life isn't falling apart. It's reorganizing around truth instead of trauma, around being instead of becoming, around what serves your authentic nature instead of what soothes your wounded ego. The void wasn't punishment for healing. It was preparation for authentic living. Your psyche refused to let you settle for performance when genuine expression was available. It protected you from rebuilding the same life on a new foundation by insisting you wait until the real foundation was ready. This is why rushing back into action too quickly feels wrong, why forcing old patterns feels impossible, why trying to motivate yourself the old way feels like pushing against a door that's locked from the inside. Your inner wisdom knows the difference between ego drive and soul call, between manufactured motivation and organic inspiration. It won't let you go backward even when forward isn't clear yet. When motivation returns, and it will return, it feels like coming home to yourself. Not the frantic energy of fear disguised as excitement, but the steady pulse of purpose. Not the manufactured enthusiasm of should, but the quiet certainty of yes. Not the desperate hunger of never enough, but the gentle magnetism of just right. This new motivation doesn't burn you out because it's not taking more than it gives. It doesn't disappear when obstacles arise because it's rooted in who you are, not what you want to achieve. It doesn't require constant feeding because it comes from abundance, not deficit. It doesn't need external validation because it knows its own worth. You might find yourself saying yes to opportunities that don't make logical sense, but feel spiritually aligned. You might discover interests you never knew you had, talents you never thought to develop, callings you never imagined possible. This isn't because you've become someone new. It's because you've finally become who you've always been underneath the performance. The healed version of ambition looks like someone following their curiosity rather than their calendar, their intuition rather than their timeline, their soul's whisper rather than the world's shout. It's sustainable because it's authentic. It's fulfilling because it's aligned. It's peaceful because it's true. You write because you have something to share, not because you need validation. You create because beauty is moving through you, not because you need to be seen as creative. You love because connection is your nature, not because you're afraid of being alone. You work because the work itself calls to you, not because you need to prove your worth through productivity. When Jung talked about individuation, this is what he meant. Not becoming perfect, but becoming real. not achieving some idealized version of yourself, but discovering and expressing who you actually are when you're not trying to be anyone else. You are not broken for losing ambition. You are not behind for feeling unmotivated. You are not failing for outgrowing the goals that once drove you. You are exactly where your soul needs you to be. The silence isn't empty. It's pregnant with possibility. The void isn't punishment. It's preparation. Your authentic self has been waiting patiently for the performer to step aside. This isn't the end of your story. It's the comma between who you've been and who you're becoming. Carl Jung knew that the most profound transformations happen in the dark, in the quiet, in the spaces between one breath and the next. Your soul didn't abandon ambition. It simply refused to keep feeding a life that was never authentically yours. The motivation that emerges from this sacred pause will be worth the wait. If this video resonated with your journey through the void, share in the comments when you realized your old ambitions belonged to someone else, and subscribe for more insights that honor the sacred work of becoming who you really are.